Welcome back to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. In the final segment of today's program, we are going to speak with Dr. Andy Lee Roth. He is the Associate Director of Project Censored, co-editor with me of umpteen censored annual volumes now, including most recently, Project Censored State of the Free Press 2023. One of the things that we've been doing at Project Censored here this past year is running a series of articles largely by folks either associated with the project or on issues around media. And Andy Roth has penned a recent piece for our Dispatches in Media Politics titled "The Lifeblood of Democracy." Journalists are on the front lines of battles to defend the right to freedom of expression. And this is, I think, a very timely article. It's an article that really extends from the themes that have really run through many censored books, especially the last couple of years, with the many different challenges and including serious threats to journalists and people wanting to inform the public about key matters, not just abroad, but right here, even in the United States, where the U.S. ranks around 42nd now in press freedom. It's been vacillating between 42 and 44. So that's a far cry from the we're number one of the exceptionalist cries we often hear here in the United States. And Andy Lee Roth, welcome back to the Project Censored Show to talk about this very important issue.
Thanks, Mickey. It's always a pleasure to join you on the airwaves.
Yes, it's great to have you on with us, Andy. So let's hear about the lifeblood of democracy. You've got three major themes and points that go throughout this piece.
Yeah, I mean, the first is that two cornerstones of democracy, freedom of expression and freedom of information, are under concerted attack in the United States and around the world. A second kind of major point of the Lifeblood article is that journalists are on the front lines of defending those freedoms. The importance of understanding journalists in the many important roles they play in our lives as also being defenders of human rights. And the third key point of the article is that role is in some sense grounded in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was instituted in 1948 in the aftermath of World War II, and is coming up on its 75th anniversary later this year. So I was prompted to write this article in part thinking about that anniversary and the importance of Article 19 for all of the work that we at Project Censored do, and also inspired by Mickey, our mutual colleague, Misha Hercules, who is, of course, one of Project Censored's esteemed judges, an editor at the Marcaz Review, and Misha's work on the connections between human rights education and critical media literacy education has been an influence on me. So a shout out to Misha and her work for inspiring this article as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And this program is airing during the week where Press Freedom Day is, right, on May 3rd. The past week here was a week dedicated to Daniel Ellsberg week. So these themes really continue. And you mentioned Article 19. Maybe read, or let's hear what exactly is the verbiage of Article 19, and maybe we can connect that to the rest of the article.
Yeah, so Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, established in 1948, says, and I quote, "Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers." And I often think about that, and we actually wrote some about this in our the book "The Media and Me," our guide to critical media literacy for young people. In 1948, that notion of seeking, receiving, and imparting information through any media, regardless of frontiers, must have sounded almost like science fiction, right? How, beyond frontiers. Of course, in an internet age where digital connections shrink the size of the world and make some of those boundaries and frontiers a little more permeable, this notion is still a challenging one. Of course, one criticism that people often say is, well, everyone has the right to say anything. That's not necessarily good. And that's something that people have recognized going all the way back to ancient Greece, where our notions of free speech in part derive from. The ancient Greek term parrhesia is conventionally translated as free speech, but when Michel Foucault gave a series of lectures on the topic in Berkeley in 1983, he noted, among other things, that that Greek term could be translated literally as to say everything, or it could be translated as to tell the truth. And I read Article 19 not as saying everyone has the right to say everything. Incitements to violence against people is not part of the free speech kind of parameters. But the idea that Article 19 provides us with a compass that keeps us oriented in the right direction when we're thinking about restrictions on freedom of information and freedom of expression.
Indeed. And we live at a time when there are significant threats to expression and of course, even to journalists physically, as we've written about. Maybe you can talk about some of the examples, both here in the US and maybe around the world, of some of the stories that you've been tracking and that you write about here in your article on the lifeblood of democracy, Andy Lee Roth.
Yeah. I mean, here in the US, I think everyone who probably pays attention on a regular basis to the Project Censored show knows about efforts to ban books in schools, often done in the name of protecting children. Project Censored has written, of course, about efforts by entities like the Department of Homeland Security to govern, quote, govern misinformation. Globally, we know the role of big tech in kind of engaging in algorithmic gatekeeping. In many countries around the world since the COVID-19 pandemic, governments have passed so-called fake news laws that ostensibly were used to restrict misinformation about the pandemic and public health responses to it, but in fact and in practice have been used by governments to suppress journalism and news outlets that are critical of those governments. Liam O'Connell, who was a Project Censored intern a couple summers ago, Liam and I wrote an article about how that played out or is playing out in Malaysia. That article was published in the Index on Censorship. So around the world, if we go back to Project Censored yearbooks past, we've covered stories about global internet shutdowns, or I'm sorry, I shouldn't say global internet shutdowns. I should say internet shutdowns that take place around the world in specific countries. Also, I always think of the study that PEN America did, I believe it was 2014, showing how government surveillance programs were having a chilling effect on writers, again, all around the world, not just here in the United States. So there are numerous threats to freedom of expression and freedom of information. This is just a kind of, what's the right word? We shouldn't even call these highlights, lowlights of some of those threats. And one of the points of the article is that the Lifeblood of Democracy article is that journalists are on the front lines in defending against these threats to freedom of expression and freedom of information. By the very nature of their work, they're helping to inform members of the public about stories and issues and events that we would not otherwise know about, right? And therefore, they are human rights defenders. And they're human rights defenders of specific human rights, the rights to freedom of expression and freedom of information, that are considered by human rights advocates to be foundational human rights. This is an important point. The idea that without the right to freedom of information, in the absence of freedom of expression, people are made more vulnerable to having their other fundamental human rights violated or disrespected. So we must protect freedom of information and access to information as foundational human rights.
Therefore, we all need to be concerned about the state of the free press and the plight of journalists to perform that vital civic task. I mean, it's a duty, really. In fact, the First Amendment in the United States protects against government interference, but as we've long discussed and written, there's censorship by proxy. There's a lot of other different challenges and different ways that information is curtailed and controlled, right up to and including press freedom violations in the U.S., like arrests or assaults or literal violence against journalists. And you write in the article, Andy Lee Roth, you cite the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, which we're want to cite about such dark affairs. Maybe you can talk a little bit more specifically about how that connects into the article.
Yeah, I mean, many people, when they think about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and if they know about Article 19, which declares the freedom of opinion and freedom of expression as fundamental human rights, they think, well, that's kind of an anachronism from a bygone era of international politics, right? We're so far from 1948 today. Or in the context of the US, many people, if they know about Article 19, would dismiss it as a redundancy. We have the First Amendment here that protects journalists. But I think one of the things that if you spend any time looking at the US Press Freedom Tracker and its careful documentation of the shocking regularity with which journalists working in the United States are subject to arrest and equipment seizures and assaults and interrogation by law enforcement, you realize that the First Amendment, though it holds press freedom sacrosanct, there's a gap between the ideal and the actual practice. The most extreme version of that is when journalists are killed for doing their work. And again, there's a tendency for a lot of people to think, oh, well, that's something that happens to journalists in other countries, right?
Right.
Journalists in Mexico, of course, they're vulnerable to being having their lives threatened for doing their work. But it happens here in the United States too. And one of the cases that I mentioned that I think is so important and shockingly underreported, back in September of last year, Jeff Herman, a longtime investigative reporter at the Las Vegas Review-Journal, was stabbed out to death outside his home by a former government official who Herman had written about and had ongoing investigations about. So here in the U.S., despite the protections of the First Amendment and kind of aura of those protections that many people seem to think has a kind of a halo effect for all journalists, Jeff Herman lost his life for doing his job as a journalist. And that, of course, has a potentially chilling effect on other journalists. And that is the impetus for this article. And what you just said, Mickey, a moment ago, I want to reiterate here now. It may seem far removed to us when we learn that journalists in Nigeria are effectively being censored by bogus copyright claims made against their articles. One of the top 20, or one of the stories that Project Censored is considering for inclusion in our top 25 story list now. That may seem far removed to us, both by geography, and most of us aren't professional journalists. But the key point here is that when journalists' rights to information and expression are thwarted, that has a corrosive effect on all of our rights to freedom of information, freedom of expression, freedom of opinion. And so it is in our collective interest to defend journalists. And that's not an abstract notion. That means that we all need to be making calls to end impunity for crimes against journalists, right? And there are important organizations. I can't name them all now, but I would say the Committee to Protect Journalists, the Reporters Without Borders, the International Press Institute, and many others that do that important work. And those organizations deserve our support for exactly the reasons we've been talking about today.
Absolutely. Andy Lee Roth, Associate Director of Project Censored, author most recently of this article we've been discussing. And you can find it for free at projectcensored.org. The Lifeblood of Democracy. Journalists are on the front lines of battles to defend the right to freedom of expression. Andy Lee Roth, thanks as ever, not only for your excellent article, but for joining us today to talk about it on the Project Censored Show.
Thank you, Mickey.